Hello, Mr. Coleman.
How you doing?
Fine, thank you. And thank you for accepting my invitation to be on my channel.
My
So,
pleasure.
would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Adam Coleman. I'm a writer, author of a book called Black Victim, Black Victor. I have a show, a web series called Breaking Bread, where I sit down and have conversations with people, discuss politics, life, anything that comes to mind. And yeah, I feel like there's a whole bunch of stuff. I'm a brand ambassador for XXXY. And I'm probably missing other things, but I've written for a whole bunch of publications at this point.
Please elaborate on these t-shirts. I gather it's something about being a man and being a woman, but I don't know exactly what it signifies.
Yeah, so so there's an athletic wear company started by Jennifer Say. She used to be with Levi Strauss, and she started this athletic brand called XXXY Athletics, and asked me to be a part of her, to be a part of as far as being a brand ambassador for her new company. It's been around, man, probably just about 6 months, less than 6 months, and it's already doing very well. Makes great products, and yeah, I'm part of their advertising campaign as well.
Oh, so it's a business thing. It has nothing to do with the transgender issues, with the
It
transgender.
does, it does in a sense because they're the only brand that is overtly standing against men entering women's spaces. Um, So that is one of the key areas, and especially for Jennifer. Jennifer is a former Olympic athlete, so for her this is a very personal thing as well.
How come they're not canceled yet?
They have in some ways, but sometimes being canceled actually is much more beneficial than
Helps.
not being canceled.
Improves your ratings.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, this is one big difference between the cancel culture and living under socialism. Because under socialism, when they cancel you, there are no ratings. Very often you are
Hmm.
taken away, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's final. It's irreversible. Okay. So you were born under capitalism. I was born under socialism. You were born black. I was born white. And yet it turns out we have something in common in our bios. We
Hmm.
both grew up without fathers.
Hmm.
I met my father when I was 20. He said that we arranged a meeting in the city. He said that he will be holding magazine such and such so that I could recognize him. I said that I will be holding newspaper such and such so that he could recognize me. And for a few years, from my me being 20 until maybe 25 or 26, we used to meet from time to time. And then he decided that he doesn't care to meet me anymore, and that was it. So he changed his mind twice. First when I was
Uh,
20, and then after I was 26. So would you like to share your story?
yeah, my father, I don't even know where to start. I guess my father wasn't really active throughout my life. My father was always married just to somebody else. So, we were kind of like the other family. Um, we he would come around once in a while, um, but I never felt like my father was there to see me. I felt like he was there for other reasons. Sometimes because we had moved some states away, and he was he would stop by because he was going to New York City, and we lived sort of close to New York, and he would stay there with us while he was visiting New York. But I never felt like he was coming to see us. He was just staying with us on his way through. Um, and I would hear from him once in a while. None of our phone calls were memorable, other than that. It was very awkward. It almost felt like I never asked my mom, but it always felt like my mother put him on the phone and or he was talking to my mother and she asked, "Do you want to talk to your son?" You know. So it was never an emphasis on his part to be a part of my life. The last time I saw him, I was 16. The last time I talked to him, I called him on the phone, and I was 21. It was shortly after my son was born, and he just didn't seem very interested. And I actually felt like I was bothering him. So I just said, I'm not even going to try anymore. If he attempted to reach out to me, I would talk to him, but he never did. And he died a handful of years ago. So, um, and I found out he passed away a few months after he passed away. So there was never really any relationship there. Um, and there's a lot of wounds kind of left behind from that neglect.
Hmm. So he never bothered actually to talk to you just for no reason, or to take you to, I don't know, fishing or something, just to be around. None of this.
The most I ever remember is he took me shopping one time. That's from what I remember. He did give me his old car. It was a 1990 Cavalier. That was my first car, but it was motivated by my mother having him, give me a vehicle. Um, so he did that. But I mean, he paid child support through the state. Um, and maybe in some people's eyes, that's great. He cared, but um, I don't think that was enough as far as being there in my life
Yeah.
because those child support checks don't really mean much. Um, they're not really memorable. What is memorable is, or would be memorable if he was actually involved in my life.
Same here. My father paid child support, but he was never around. Like I said, we didn't know what we look like. This is why we had to do this thing with the magazine and the newspaper,
Mhm.
like spies who meet in some cheap spy. This whole thing. Weirdly enough, in your case, I gather that your mother initiated and tried to remind him to behave like a father. In my case, weirdly, it looks like his second wife reminded him to behave like a father to me, although I was not her child. You wouldn't expect that. But she
Mhm.
was a normal, as far as I can tell. She was a normal woman, and she liked normality, and she probably thought that what's going on is not normal, which it
Yeah.
wasn't, which it wasn't. But then when she was no longer around, eventually he divorced her as well. And when she was no longer around, his second wife, not my mother again, he just lost interest. There was no reason for him to pretend anymore. I mean, here, these are my musings. I don't know really, because I'm puzzled by the whole story. I never understood him. I never. I'm not trying to understand him anymore. Okay, let's move. Let's
Yeah.
move away from this to your book. So uh, I like how you use alliteration, like this sentence. Why should my pigmentation determine my aspirations? Pigmentation, aspiration. I like this melody. Uh, would you like to share how you edit your work? How what your process involves of writing? I mean,
Yeah. So people understand my book was the first thing I really ever attempted to write. Um, I've done, like most people, some social media stuff, um, but very little of it. Uh, the longest thing I've ever written was, when I was into cars years ago. So this was like my first real writing attempt. And I just tried to write like I speak for the most part. That's how I started. And then over time, you just kind of figure out what feels comfortable, um, literation wise. And my comfort comes with analogies. I like doing stuff like that, even in the articles that I write. Um, but what you just read was from the introduction called Questions, and that was actually the last thing I wrote. Was the introduction to kind of set the stage for the rest of the book. And I I guess my general approach was to do lots of storytelling. And that's my MO with most of my writings. I do a little bit of storytelling. It's usually very personal. Um, and I try to have people, even if they don't agree with me, understand where I'm coming from. So my attempt at writing is always from a good faith standpoint. Even if I disagree with something, I try to have good faith, being that like I'm not just some partisan. Like I have legitimate reasons why I disagree with this person or why I don't like this idea, and I try to explain it. And I'm not just repeating what I just heard from somebody else. I can explain why I feel the way that I feel. Um, so the the biggest thing that I'm proud of when it comes to this book is that there are people that I've talked to. Like I read the book. There's some things I don't agree with, but I think it was a good book, and I understand where you're coming from. And that's all I was looking for. I don't need for people to 100% agree with everything that I say. We're all different. We have different experiences, different perspectives. But all I cared about was being understood as far as where my heart is and where I'm coming from. And even though I'm criticizing things that are in some cases are taboo, there's a reason for it. I'm not just trying to beat something over the stick. Like I care. And sometimes the things that you care about, you have to criticize. And I think we've lost that in many ways, the ability to criticize things that we care about. And so we just let the things that we care about fail over and over because we're afraid of potentially, possibly hurting someone's feelings. Um, and I think we should be able to risk hurting someone's feelings to tell them the truth because we love them and we care. So when I criticize aspects of Black culture, it's because I care, you know. Um, when I talk about the failures of some men when it comes to their children, it's because I care. I care about the outcomes of children who look like me and don't look like me. I care about children. Um, and so if we're going to change something, you're changing it for a reason. It's because it's a problem. You don't change things that are working. Um, and we have to identify the problem. We have to examine the problem. We have to criticize it. And then that's how we change it. So I think we're much stuck on even claiming that it's a problem and going any further past that, nevertheless getting to the point of actually like healthily criticizing it.
Here's another quote that caught my attention. Why is Martin Luther King given a hero status, but we never listen to our hero's message? I remembered when I read this, I remembered one interview I watched on CNN once, where the people there in the studio were outraged that some conservative has dared to quote Martin Luther King. And actually, it turns out Martin Luther King is more useful. Martin Luther King's quotes are more useful to conservatives these days than to liberals. That's the interesting thing. For example, I like his definition of racism because it's the shortest one and the most poetic one I've ever read. Judging somebody by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character.
Right.
If we apply this definition to the woke message, to the woke politics today, it turns out that the woke people are racist because they judge people by the color of their skin, not individually by the content of their character. Which brings me again to your book. So for the woke people, the blacks are victims because they are black, apparently. I mean, the color of the skin determines whether you're a victim. And
Right.
if you're white, you are privileged. Again, the color of the skin puts you in this basket. Uh, so, would you like to elaborate on this? On Martin Luther King becoming the actually being quoted more often by conservatives these days.
Yeah, I mean, the I think Martin Luther King, well, I'll say this. I think we were, call me idealistic, but I think that we were at a point where this topic wasn't discussed nearly as much because it didn't need to be discussed. Um, I often talk to people who think about the 1990s into the early 2000s as far as like the era where race wasn't nearly as important. Were there some little race moments that happen, maybe like some random police shooting that someone tried to make a much bigger thing? Obviously, like the O.J. Simpson situation happened in the early 90s. But there
So
was a
actually,
period.
what you're saying actually means that what Martin Luther King dreamt of,
Mhm.
that his daughters will be judged, the full quote, that actually this was achieved.
Not fully, because
Yeah, not
obviously,
fully, not perfectly, but by and
yeah,
large.
right. By and large, yes. By and large, yes. It wasn't something that needed to be discussed um, so fervently by people who look like me and people who don't look like me. It wasn't something that actually you were seen as weird if you wanted to talk about it all the time. Even by some black people, where they were like the whole pro-black, everything must be black, everything must come from the Mother Earth who's black. It's just like that kind of image was always depicted as this guy's a bit off. And it's not to say that um, race discussions never happen or anything like that, but um, it was not important. It was not important in everyday life. It was not important to discuss 24/7. It wasn't the thing that ruled the day, even in the media. But there was a shift. There was a noticeable shift in dialogue. There's a noticeable shift coming from a certain group of people, a certain intellectual class of people. Um, it was coming from the upper class, and it started happening more and more. And oddly enough, the thing that you would think like we made it to a certain point, Barack Obama becomes elected overwhelmingly, and yet the discussion got worse, not better. Um, and you would think that it would get better, but then it actually got worse. Um, and so now I feel like we have regressed to an extent, but I do think that most people feel the same way that I do. Um, as far as is race important in our lives? No. Most people have bigger issues than race. Most people are just trying to survive like everybody else. They're trying to work their job, make enough money to make ends meet. They're not moving about the world in their white skin or in their black skin. They're just moving about the world and they're interacting with people of all different backgrounds, especially if you live in a metropolitan area. I live in a suburban area in New Jersey, and my building is like the United Nations. You have people from all different backgrounds, um, all races who live here, even religious backgrounds, and we all get along. Everything is fine. We're all neighborly. So, this idea that we walk around and we're just like waiting to prejudge each other and measure our oppression against each other. I think that that's mostly something that is drummed up by our media. But regular people don't operate that way. Like some do. Obviously, there are those people who exist. There are those illogical, hate-filled people or victim-riddled people who exist out there who are just looking to make an example out of somebody. But the vast majority of people are relatively normal. And as far as their interaction, they don't see the world in that way.
You mentioned the intellectuals, and this reminds me of Thomas Sowell, whose portrait is behind you.
Yeah.
That's another thing we have in common. He is my guru as well. And he, of course, he wrote Intellectuals and Society, where he basically demonstrated that at the bottom of every calamity during the last 100 years, there are intellectuals.
Hmm.
He loves to make this point that good education and knowledge doesn't guarantee decisions that how to put it, excuse me, English is not my mother tongue,
It's okay.
uh, doesn't equate good decisions, good decision making.
Yeah.
That it only guarantees good rationalizations. I cannot remember the exact quote, but he likes to repeat saying these things over and over again, because it's true. When you go into history, you see that there is no correlation between education and good decision making. And he was not alone, by the way. Just to top of my mind, I remember George Orwell has a famous quote that certain things are so absurd only an intellectual could believe them. So
Yeah.
sometimes people who are common people who cannot talk properly and cannot explain things properly actually have a lot more common sense. That was his point. Uh,
Yeah. It's the difference between knowledge and wisdom.
yes, yes, he always makes this distinction. Uh, you talk about the victimhood culture, and I was thinking that actually the victimhood culture is there in every major social engineering movement. Used socialism, the victims were the workers, the privileged were the bourgeoisie, the
Hmm.
capitalists. National socialism, the victims were the Germans, the privileged were again the same capitalists plus the Jews. Then feminism, the victims are women, the privileged are men, and of course these days it's wokeism with all sorts of victims. I mean, some are black, some have special sexual orientation, some are something else. Now these days, of course, the migrants become victims, and it goes on and on and on. There are always victims, and of course the flip side of this is not accepting responsibility, because basically they tell certain categories of people not to take ownership of the problems. So
Right.
workers are poor because of capitalism, not because they haven't done well. Of course, the Germans are not to blame for anything. They were blameless victims. They never they couldn't be blamed for World War One. And of course, it goes on and on. I don't need to go through the last 100 years. Uh, is in this line of thought, wokeism just another social engineering movement like socialism and Nazism and feminism and all these isms?
I believe so. Um, I believe this is something that stems from certain institutions, with the objective of capturing as many as many prominent positions to change society. Um, it's not the it's not the situation where a quarter of America believes in wokeism, because that's not the case. Um, it's far more fringe than that. But the problem is the people who do believe in it are in positions where they can enforce it, they can propagandize it, they can leverage it, and they have control over many of our lives. Um, and that's where like the media is very, very impactful. The media is filled with many liberal arts college graduates. Many of them went to school for journalism and the same institutions where they're learning about oppression, where they're learning about power plus privilege. They're learning about critical race theory. They're learning about all of these different concepts. And so what's going to happen? Well, they're going to come out into the job market and they're going to flood the job market in their worldview. And you give them in a position, you put them in a position where they can dictate the conversation. They can interpret the world from their new lens that they just learned about in school. Um, and for people who didn't go to college, for people who just work a regular 9 to 5, when they turn it on, it seems like cult speak. Like it seems like a foreign concept as far as what people are talking about. Um, and there's a whole language that's involved and new terminology that's involved. And it's only something that is fully understood by someone who wanted to immerse themselves in this ideology. Um, but I think it's this far fringe movement of people who went through the university institutions, who ended up in positions of authority, whether it be human resources. Now we have DEI within certain corporations. We have boardrooms of people who are younger and they're coming through and they have this in mind. I would even go as far as saying the top universities are the most indoctrinated places in the country. So the Princetons, the Harvards, the Yales,
intellectuals.
yeah, exactly. They're the worst of all the schools. So, and on top of that, they leave there knowing that they came from the top school and they're the future leaders of America, and they have this sense of entitlement to do something now with this knowledge, um, not just knowledge as far as whatever field they went to school in, but this knowledge of how to see the world. Um, and so they're going to do something about it. They're going to become activists in a small and greater sense. And I think that is the much bigger problem, is that we have a large group of entitled elitists who come out of schools believing they need to control what we do, and they do everything possible to do so.
You sound like a fan of George Orwell in cult speak, wrong speak. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Looks like it. You use the same. I was thinking today how these how in culture these phrases go are recycled. No, recycled is not the right word. Remixed, because it started with a commie propaganda in the Soviet Union, Navayaz, in Russian, which is an abbreviation, roughly newspeak. And then George Orwell took it and translated it into English so that the English speaking public could get it. And now you are taking it on, and how this tradition goes on and on and on. These memes, how they have a life on their own. But back to the victimhood. Usually, when one studies these social engineering movements, usually the people who suffer at the end of the day are precisely the people who are meant to benefit from these movements. So the workers who are meant to benefit from socialism, they ended up enslaved in the Soviet concentration camps. The Germans who were meant to benefit from Nazism, they ended up destroyed. And of course, women were meant to benefit from feminism. They ended up childless and familyless and unhappy. And the list goes on and on. So again, does this apply to the Black people who are the present day victims, the new victims?
Yes. And I would go as far as saying there are aspects of Black culture that have been infected with feminism. And it's been going on for decades.
I'm laughing at the word infected.
I mean, that's what it feels like. And what's so insidious about it is that if you were to talk to some of them, they wouldn't say that they're feminists. They don't see it. No, I'm not a feminist. That's some white college girl thing. But I mean, the only thing they're missing is they don't have nose rings and pink hair. They sound just like them. The ideology, the mindset, the antagonism towards men, these things are part of culture. They exist amongst many Black women and even some Black men. they've accepted this weakened position as a man, um, that they are to be talked to and talked down to, and allows it, and they're okay with it. They're okay with being doormats. Um, and I think that is just the feminism part just goes to show like how a bad idea can infect a large group of people and become normalized within culture. So much so that people don't even recognize it for what it is, and they just adapt to it, and they think they're empowered by it. And really, if you were to step back, you see how weakened it's making all of us. Um, so yeah, this is something that's been going on for quite some time. It's just gradually getting worse. And now that we're in the information age, um, it becomes very visual that this thing exists, and and more people have social media to discuss it or even to exhibit their behavior. Um, and you can see the response. So if you see something that's like obviously feminism laced rhetoric coming from one individual person, you can now see hundreds of comments of someone who's just like that person agreeing with the feminist rhetoric. And it's just like a microcosm of the problem, and you can see how deep it actually goes. Um, so I think it's a much, much bigger problem, feminism amongst Black Americans than people realize. Okay.
So we were talking about the victims, that those who are supposed to be held by social movements, social engineering movements, always paying the price. Uh,
Yeah.
and this brings me to the question: is this the people who come with these ideas about helping the victims? Are they cynics who know that this will not help anybody, but who want to make careers, or are they useful idiots who don't realize? So is this treachery, or is it stupidity? What do you think?
I think it's both.
It's both.
I think it depends on the individual. I think there are I think there are well-intentioned people who are coming from a good place, but don't realize that they're following um, ideology that is very much so narcissistic and sociopathic in many ways. Um, and I also think that there are people who aren't true believers, but they're power seekers. And so they know that this doesn't work, but that's not the point. The point for them is to leverage it for power, leverage it for influence. And sure, okay, there's some inconsistencies, and all right, there might be some hypocrisy, but you know what? Um, it's still worth it because at the end of the day, the ends justify the means. So why not? Why not move further with it? Um, and in some ways, I think that the true believers, the ones who are the useful idiots, are much more dangerous than the malicious actors, because the true believers will run through a wall for what they believe in, and they are so entrenched in what they believe is correct that they're willing to, in some cases, die for what they believe in. The people who aren't true believers, who know this, they're not willing to go that far, right? And they don't need to, because they have people who are willing to go on the front lines and die for the cause. So they don't need to do that. I think it's much in the same way. It's the difference between the guy who's the suicide bomber who really thinks he's going to get a whole bunch of virgins in the afterlife, and the guy who commissions the suicide bomber, right? Two completely different people.
I like your analogy. I like it. So it's you. I guess you view the wokeism as a religion, then, as a sort of quasi-religion.
Yeah, I would call it a non-theistic religion.
Non-theistic
Um,
religion. Okay.
yeah, in many ways, because I've actually talked about this. In many ways, I say this as a Christian, there are elements where it sounds very religious. Um, for example, the whole white privilege. Um, for them, white privilege is original sin. That's how they treat it. And so for them, even though they may be white, and even though they have this inherited privilege, like how we would say original sin, there's nothing that they can do to get rid of that. Much in the same way, a Christian acknowledges that no matter how hard they try, they can't get rid of that sinful nature. So there's a lot of similarities. That's just one of those areas. So even when they say white privilege, in their speak, it doesn't mean the same thing like how a normal person would understand white privilege would mean it. For them, they see it in a completely different way. It means something different. Um, and so that's why they behave in that particular way. Um, so yeah, there's definitely religious aspects. It's not just an ideology. Um, much in the same way, like you have cultural Christians who, celebrate Christmas, right? But then you have religious Christians who go to church every Sunday, read the Bible, things of that nature. I think you have people who are culturally woke, and then you have people who are like incredibly dogmatically woke, um, who follow the doctrine and who follow all the readings and the teachings of their institutional masters.
But if you're correct, this means that the evidence is irrelevant, that the evidence doesn't matter, that whatever facts and no matter how well you source these facts, at the end of the day, they will believe what they want to believe. And which would also mean that writing books like yours ultimately will not achieve anything. Just like the books of Thomas Sowell ultimately achieved nothing. I can sense his bitterness because he had made the case many years ago, and yet the people still do stupid things. The evidence doesn't change anything.
Well, it depends on what your objective is. So for me, my objective is to never, like, my goal was never to turn someone who is woke into not being woke. I think that's a waste of time. We would never send the military into Afghanistan to convert the Taliban into being Christians. You're wasting your time.
I'm
But
laughing at your analogy again.
I told you I
Send
like
the military
analogies.
to convert the Taliban into Christians.
But one thing that you can do
Well,
is,
in a sense, this is what was done already. Okay, it was not to convert them from Islam to Christianity, but it was to convert them from their Afghan ways
Mhm,
into modernity,
right.
to make them have constitutionalism, equal rights for women, and all that things. Basically, to make them Western people. So the
Yeah.
military was sent for 20 years or so to Afghanistan to achieve uh, making Afghanistan a Western country.
Yeah. And we saw how well that worked out. Um, but yeah, so my goal is to never convert extremists, um, or someone who's incredibly dogmatic into not being that. I feel like those people, anything is possible. I feel like those people come out of it on their own or when there are enough contradictions that make them finally question what they're doing. It's in the same way as a cult member. Um, it is very, very difficult to force someone to come out of a cult. It's an entirely overwhelming process to bring someone out of a particular cult mentality. But what you can do is keep people from joining the cult. And so my goal is to make sure that the people who aren't radicalized yet stay not radicalized. That's ultimately my goal, is to see a population of people who aren't radicalized, who are saying, hey, I never really looked at my neighbor who was black as being black. I just saw them as my neighbor. Does this mean I need to look at this look at them in a different way. I don't feel comfortable moving this way, but I'm being encouraged to. And so I would love, and I know actually, I know someone who I helped to prevent from going that route, who was heading in that direction. I actually wrote about them in the book, but not specifically for that very reason. But they later told me, I was going down this dark path of thinking negatively about Black people because of BLM, because of all the riots. And you helped me to not go down that route because that would have been wrong and that would have been illogical. And that to me is the point. You're always going to have extremists. You're always going to have, the extremists on the left or the right. You're going to have illogical people. You're going to have hateful people. These people are always going to exist. But my want is to minimize the amount of people who fit into those particular boxes. And what I'm seeing is, unfortunately, these days, a bipartisan effort to radicalize people into whatever direction that the propagandists reside in. Right now, I think the biggest detriment is coming from the woke left because they have more social power. But I think what we should be fighting against is authoritarianism. And authoritarianism shows up in many ways in American life. It's just that one has way more social power, way more social currency. But trust and believe, if the pendulum swung in a different direction, there are authoritarians who exist on the right who are just waiting for the moment for them to have power. And so while I would say they're both dangerous, one has more danger currently today, but I'm worried about radicalization happening from both sides.
Your book seems to sell well, and it has generated many positive reviews on Amazon. So why do you think that is? Why do people like your book?
Because it's relatable. It's someone was telling me actually that they use the word sensitive, and as a guy, sensitive is supposed to be like an insult, but no, it actually I am sensitive. I'm very careful about the words that I use. I'm very careful about how I portray something. I am sensitive to these things, and that shows care, right? I care about the topic that I'm talking about, and I want you to understand where I'm coming from. So it is not, I think I do a little bit of trickery because I think people go into the book thinking it's going to be one thing, and it turns out to be something else. It turns out to be a very relatable book and understandable, critical, but not antagonistic. And people who don't look like me see something within it and they understand. There are people who do look like me who say, my eyes are open, and you know what? You helped me to understand something or see something that I didn't really see before. And that can only happen because I approached it in a good faith nature. I didn't want to approach it, wagging my finger and saying, I'm smarter than everybody, blah, 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 blah. I criticize my mother, I criticize my father, and I criticize myself in the book, right? Because I'm not perfect, I'm human, but I have my perspective, and here's what I went through. So in many ways, the book touches upon different things. It touches upon race, it talks about family, it talks about growth as an individual, it talks about personal struggles, it talks about life lessons, things I learned, even using a situation and how you interpret that situation, and why I would look at it in this particular way versus a different way. And willingness to admit that I might be wrong here. Talk about morality. Like I talk about a whole bunch of different things. So it's a very thoughtful book in that way. I didn't want it to be a political book. I didn't want it to be a Black conservative book. I wanted it to be a book of depth that anyone can pick up. So I'm glad that people saw that. One of my favorite reviews was from someone who was like, the book started off good, and then they got to the feminism chapter, and then they went on like this long tirade about claiming that I'm blaming Black women for everything. and and then they went on and said the rest of the book was good, 3 stars. So even though I really pissed them off with that one chapter, they still gave me 3 stars. So I do appreciate that. So yeah, I thought that was funny. That'll always stick out in my head. So I think for the most part, like people understand at least where I'm coming from.
But we know what comes with success, cancellation. Have they tried to cancel you yet?
You know, the funny thing is no. And the reason being is because it's much easier to cancel someone who is afraid of being canceled, and two, who is hiding themselves, right? Because that's the weapon, you know, that's the thing, not the weapon, that's the thing you're trying to protect, right? If you're Joe Schmo who tweets something and you're like, oh no, they'll come for my job. I'm holding on to this. I'm really scared. I wrote this book understanding that my job may not like it. I didn't know. I didn't ask for their permission, and I was okay with losing my job. I was with well, she's my wife now, but we were in a relationship, and she supported it, and she understood why I was doing it, and she knew the possibility. So I was prepared for the worst, and none of that happened, and quite the opposite. My job supported it. The CEO bought like 5 copies. They were all proud of me. I switched to a different job. They eventually found out and they supported it. So I try to tell people like the cancel mob exists, but it is much more a fear than it is a reality. Most people won't get canceled for saying something that they feel. And especially when you're not scared of it, when you put your, yes, my name is Adam B. Coleman. This is what I look like. I'm not afraid. They can't hurt you in any sort of way. You know, they can only hurt you if you're trying to hide something. And for the most part, I work for myself and I have multiple streams of income. But at the end of the day, like I wrote it because I wanted to write it. I didn't write it to become famous. I didn't think any of this would happen. I wrote it because I wanted to make a point and I wanted to express myself and I wanted to leave something dedicated for my son. Those things were really important to me. So if it means I lost my job, then I lost my job. I'll find another one. I've been through much worse. So so yeah, that was basically my mindset.
Does the fact that you're Black help? Does it protect you from cancellation?
It doesn't protect me from cancellation, but I'd be a fool to say it doesn't allow me to say certain things.
Because I mean, in their mind, you are the victim, so you are one of theirs supposedly. But then again, Thomas Sowell was called white supremacist, and he was also compared to a Nazi collaborator. And Larry Elder, of course, was called the blackface of white supremacy, and the list goes on and on. So it didn't help
Yeah.
them, but still they were not cancelled.
Yeah, but I've actually
Well,
seen.
sorry to interrupt. They're too big to cancel. By the way, it's hard to cancel Thomas Sowell. I mean, obviously, it cannot be done with a few clicks or a few thousand clicks.
Well, I mean, I've seen Black people get canceled. I've seen them come for their job. I've seen them mob up. Like there's definitely that definitely exists out there. But I think what plays into it, what allows for that to happen, is when you show yourself to be scared. That motivates the mob. When you don't, then it's hard for them to go after. And on top of that, I'm very careful with my words. And so sometimes the reason why people get canceled is not necessarily because they express a viewpoint, but it's how they express a viewpoint. And so my goal isn't to piss off the left or anything like that. My goal is to stay how I feel with a purpose. Everything that I put out there is with a particular purpose. And you can't mince my words because I wrote it in a very particular way. I'm not reckless when it comes to the words that I use or the message that I put out there. So it's very hard to come after me for something I said. You can disagree, right? But I'm not being flippant. I'm not saying all these people are this or anything like that. I'm very careful what I say. I think very carefully about the things that I put out there. So it makes it even harder for them to come after me. It makes it even harder because I've publicly acknowledged that I am not a Republican. And I don't even know if I've ever called myself a conservative, at least publicly speaking, because I don't know if I am. I'm politically independent. I just think how I think. And if it fits, it fits. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And I've written articles criticizing the right and the left. So I probably fit these days more in the center right sphere, but I think it just depends on what the issue is. So it becomes very hard to put me in a particular box as being someone that you should go after and cancel because they're this. Like, am I? Am I actually that?
So if I may sum it up like this, you're not afraid of being cancelled, but you're choosing your words carefully.
Yeah, because it's not I choose my words carefully, not because I'm afraid of being canceled, but I choose my words carefully because I have a point that I'm trying to make. And I think sometimes, like, let's say, for example, I see someone on the political right. I'm associated with the political right. I see someone on the political right doing something that is illogical. If I say Bob Smith is doing this and it's wrong, it becomes Adam hates Bob Smith. Adam's a hater of the success of Bob Smith. Adam is this about Bob Smith. It no longer becomes about the message or the point that I'm trying to make. It becomes about me and Bob Smith.
This is how the culture wars work. They're not about logic and evidence. They're about who belongs to which tribe.
Right. And so that's why I don't talk about Bob Smith. I talk about the behavior of Bob Smith, absent of using his name. Because it doesn't matter that Bob Smith is doing it. It matters that this behavior is being had. And wherever it attributes, it attributes. If it attributes to Bob who's on the right or Bob who's on the left, it doesn't matter. It's the issue that's the problem. And so that's why I choose my words carefully, because I don't want to distract from the point that I'm trying to make by being about me or being about Bob. I want it to be about the behavior, the ideology. And so, yeah, it's not even about losing followers. I've said stuff and I know I've lost followers because I've said it, right? Because it pissed some people off on the right who follow me. So be it. But my goal isn't to piss people off. My goal is to say certain things at a particular time, a particular moment, because it needs to be said. But my goal isn't to beat a dead horse, the stick. Like right now, I think it's appropriate for me to say this thing, and it might be unpopular, and it's okay. And if you don't want to follow me anymore, perfectly fine. But I want to say these things, and I say it in the most eloquent way I can possibly say it. So you hear my words instead of react to my words.
Incidentally, is Amazon the best place to find your book?
Yeah, people can purchase it on Amazon, or if they want to purchase it directly from wrongspeak.net, a publishing company, they can go there and purchase a copy as well as a signed copy if they're in the United States.
Okay, and finally, I have one more question. What is the thing you would like to say without me asking? Do you have some pet thought or pet subject? I mean, I always think when I ask this question of Cato, the elder, the Roman senator who supposedly started each of his speeches with a cartridge must be destroyed or something. So do you have some pet subject or pet thought you would like to share?
I think it's really important for people to understand that propaganda is all around us. I think there is a large effort to make people who are chronically online clinically crazy. It is to make them hyper.
Sorry, the expression you used was what? Chronically online?
Yes.
Chronically online. Okay. So it's a medical condition then
Yes.
to
Like
be
they just can't
chronically
stop.
online.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's to make these people hyper paranoid, because hyper paranoid people are great consumers. And they're great consumers of propaganda and content. And um, this whole divide and conquer thing, it is bipartisan these days. And I'm, like I was saying before, I'm very worried about the direction that not just America is going, but other nations are going when it comes to this. The idea that someone who disagrees with you is automatically an enemy, um, rather than someone who has a slight different opinion than you. The idea that someone who has a slight different opinion than you automatically hates your country, um, and hates everything about you. And those people who actually hate you are very, very far and few in between. So I think there's a large effort to propagandize people for profit, whether it be mainstream media outlets or your favorite influencer. Um, their goal is to make you come back for more content. And the more you come back, the more you will radicalize yourself. I've seen it happen. It is not just a left-wing thing, it happens on the right as well. And it makes people want things and cheer on things like civil war. Um, and anyone, I've never been through a civil war, but I've talked to people who have, and it is no pleasure to be had. It is not something that people should wish upon. So I just don't think people realize that they're also being propagandized. Everyone thinks that the propaganda exists on the other side only. It's like, no, it's happening everywhere. It's all around you. So you have to be very, very critical of the information that you're taking in. Ask questions. Why are they saying this? What comes from this? Is this true? But the best way to balance propaganda is go outside, talk to people, meet people, interact with people in real life, and you'll realize that there is a disconnect between the two.
Go offline.
Yeah,
Go offline and outside.
go offline, go outside.
Okay. Thank you very much for talking to me, Mr. Coleman.
My pleasure.
See you later. Bye.
Peace.